This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
When mainstream America is not talking about whether or not black women are marriable, they're very often talking about their hair. And black women themselves spend a lot of time talking about their hair. And this is part of the focus of Chaunesti Webb's new play, I Love My Hair When It's Good, which opens at the Man Bites Dog Theater here in Durham, North Carolina. And later we're joined by Professor Jafari Allen, who talks about black queer identity in Cuba. I'm Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we're joined in studio this afternoon by Ms. Chaunesti Webb. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Chaunesti is the creator and director of the new play, I Love My Hair When It's Good, and then again when it looks defiant and impressive, which opens at the Man Bites Dog Theater here in Durham, North Carolina on March the 8th. Thanks for joining us here in studio.
Thank you for having me.
So talk a little bit about the play. I mean, in some ways, if there's a topic that comes up regularly about black women, besides whether or not they're marriable,
right?
it is about their hair. So talk
hair.
a little bit about this play.
Yeah, and if you leave a group of black women in a room long enough, we're probably going to start talking about hair. So this piece was something that I started working on when I was in graduate school at Naropa University. So about 2008, so I've been engaged with it for a long time now. Yeah. And I worked with about 7 black women in the area. It started as an opportunity for me to sort of find community because I was part of the 1% African Americans in Boulder and at Naropa, and it was really very shocking coming from Durham. And so I was, sort of trying to find my way, find an opportunity to be supported. And I was also in a Buddhist-inspired university where we were being asked to make work from what was present. Yeah. And for me, identity was what was most present. I mean, it really sort of came up for me in a way that it had never before, being in Colorado and one of the only ones. So, and when I was in Durham, I joked that I was often one of the only black people in a class. In a play, in different circumstances.
Something natural.
Yeah, but then I could go out and go to my grandma's house or go to Walmart or go to somewhere and see other people who look like me. That was the difference in Boulder. So I really started to explore the idea of identity, and the one thing that felt really present was hair. And I was also sort of going through my own hair transitions and was having a lot of conversations with women in my life.
I think I've known you for about 2 years, and I can remember distinctly probably 3 different
and I just cut it yesterday too.
Yeah, that kind of caught me off guard.
I changed a lot. So I was sort of dealing with some of my own issues around hair and my identity, and so quite naturally for me, it was the thing that I wanted to talk about and explore in a creative process. And so I got these women together and we started making work, movement and text, and we started doing interviews with women all over the country within our sort of network, and presented it in Colorado to a really enthusiastic crowd. And then I moved back to Durham and was like, what do I do with this? I don't know what it wants to be. And I started to re-engage with the material and workshopped it with a number of women in the area, a number of black women who are actors and movers and writers in Durham, and found this really interesting play.
So what is it really about hair and black women? To give you a little bit of a backdrop here. So I have 2 daughters. And they both have natural hair. Yeah. And we're here in the South, and I know you mentioned in kind of the description of the play, part of it is about these 2 girls. Yeah. Growing up in the South and kind of pushing past the boundaries of the South. And so I have these 2 daughters, they both have natural hair, and for me, I'm from up north, my experience in the South is kind of like the press and curl capital. Yeah. And folks don't always know what to do with their natural hair. Yeah. So is that something that you kind of address in the context of the play?
Yeah, we do. The hair styles and perspectives on styles spans about 30-ish years. We start like mid-70s. And so
everybody has a little afro.
Yeah, you know, we have 5 women who are all at different stages and have experienced different stages of hair.
Any Jerry curl moments?
Yeah, we do have a Jerry curl moment. Oh, it would not be a play about hair if we did not have a Jerry curl moment. Yes, there is one. You know, we've got sort of the natural path represented, that the afro, the press and curls, the big chop when a woman sort of goes from relaxed hair to natural hair.
Right.
So, yeah, it's very interesting, this relationship that we all have and how it sort of, you know, there's implications around politics, around, you know, how we perform, gender, and standards of beauty, colorism, all of that we deal a lot with in the play.
We're here this afternoon with Chaunesti Webb, who is the creator and director of the new play, I Love My Hair When It's Good, Then Again When It Looks Defiant and Impressive. Talk a little bit about that title.
Well, the title is a play on Zora Neale Hurston's, the title of her reader, and a quote of hers that she said when she saw herself in a picture. And she's just been somebody who whose work I love and have always felt really connected to. And I think the title for me is really a representation of how I feel about my hair and how I think many women probably feel. We like it when we love it when it's good, and even though we wouldn't want to admit it, sometimes we love it when it's doing its own thing.
I mean, what does it mean for Black women? And we hear this terminology all the time of a bad hair day.
Yeah.
You know, what does that mean for Black women, given, you know, some of the other cultural ramifications, historical ramifications of Black women in their hair?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I feel like we deal a lot with this idea of good hair and bad hair, and a lot of it I think has to do with texture, how tight the curl is. You know, even with women who choose to go natural, even, you know, in that process, dealing with your own natural hair and sort of getting down to what's pure, there's this hierarchy about what grade of hair is best to have, and so. I don't know, I always say...
Do you still think those kind of things are still really important to folks in our communities?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Even this most recent transition for me, I had a woman that stopped me and said, "Oh, I love that, but you can only do it because you have good hair." Wow. Yeah.
We're here with Chaunesti Webb, who's the creator and director of the new play, I Love My Hair When It's Good, and again when it looks defiant and impressive, which opens at the Man Bites Dog Theater on March the 8th, runs into the 17th here in Durham, North Carolina. Talk about the partnership with Man Bites Dog Theater.
Yeah, they've been really strong supporters of mine. Actually, Man Bites Dog was the first theater that I worked in out of college, because my undergraduate degree is actually in public relations and marketing, so that's what I went to school for. And when I finished school, you know, I'd always been interested in acting, did that all through high school, but wasn't a very practical career path.
I understand.
And my father, who's in public relations and marketing, was really, you know, helping to mold me into that direction. I'm glad of it now. In hindsight, I was very frustrated. I thought I could be so much further ahead in New York and doing big things.
But it also allowed you to think about how you get your hustle
Absolutely.
on to get a play like this.
I'm telling you.
I mean, you're currently fundraising, you know, still fundraising for the play, and I imagine that kind of training really helped in thinking about trying to put an image out there for what this is.
Yeah, and I think that's one area that performers, artists sometimes can be challenged in, is the business side of things, and certainly the marketing. We can
artists just want to be artists.
Yeah,
and
we just want to be in the process,
right,
and you know, you gotta sell it. You gotta you know, get your work out. So so that sort of has been part of my path. Yeah.
Talk about the actresses who are working on the play.
So there are 5 women in the play, and all of them are well-established actors here in Durham. Lakeisha Coffey, Yolanda Rabin, Sharita McMullen, Aurelia Belfield, and Hazel Edmond. And yeah, they're a fantastic group, and most of them I worked with early on. Like I said, I moved back and started to workshop the piece, and so they were part of some of the initial work that I was doing here.
Talk about Moni and Genevieve. You know, who are these? And we meet them as little girls. Who
We
are these
meet
little
them,
girls?
yeah. When the play starts, they're 10, and they're cousins. They have sort of grown up. Their mothers or sisters. There's 3 sisters, and then there's the grandmother whose house they sort of meet at. That's their meeting place. That's where they hang out. Grandma is very much a part of their upbringing. But Genevieve is fair-skinned and Moni is dark-skinned. And you also see some of the complexities of complexion. Those dynamics exist in the sisters, you know, that sort of has come down to the children.
Daughters,
And so Genevieve has good hair, and she is light skin, and Moni has dark hair, and so that really plays out, I think, in their relationship. But I don't think they really are able to identify that until they get older. I don't know that they realize what's happening and how they may be sort of competing against one another in some ways. But they do notice that they're treated differently by people in their community.
Let me talk a little bit about kind of a marketing question. You shot a trailer for the play.
Yeah.
And you know, that's a new thing, you know, with everybody having access to YouTube and these, I mean, they're book trailers and now play trailers. How did that kind of challenge your, you know, your creative sensibility about this? I mean, are you actually thinking about down the line maybe, you know, doing a small film around this, or?
You know, I hadn't thought about it, but video is a part of the play. You know, we use
multimedia.
We use quite a bit of video in supporting the storytelling. So it is an area that I'm very, very interested in. I've had my fair share of, you know, independent film experience, and I'm really intrigued by it. And certainly the intersection between video and theater. But that was strategic. I mean, we sort of needed a visual to go with the piece. Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by author, playwright, director Chaunesti Webb, who's talking to us about her new film, I Love My Hair When It's Good, Then Again When It Looks Defiant and Impressive. As part of this whole experience, you're doing some public events. One on March the 13th, a public screening of Chris Rock's film, Good Hair, at the National Museum here in Durham. Talk a little bit about what you hope to achieve with that. You're gonna have a panel discussion afterwards. I mean, the film itself drew a lot of criticism. You know, do you see your play as kind of a counter narrative, you know, to Good Hair, or you know, something that's just kind of pushing the conversation even further?
I might have to say that it's a counter narrative in many ways. I think what his piece, in my opinion, lacked was the contextualization of why we make the choices.
A lot of weave talk.
You know, and the business of it. And, you know, it was funny, it was Chris Rock, it was sort of to be expected. But I think what my play gets at is all of the things that we would never say out loud, that it's difficult for us to say out loud to one another and even to ourselves. And so it's a real intimate look into the varied experiences, and I can't, you know, I could never say that it's one experience, because all of our experiences are so different.
How much of this is autobiographical?
I would say, you know, quite naturally, I show up in different ways. I think that if I had to choose a character that I whose experience I relate to the most, it probably is Genevieve's. But in general, I think a lot of myself probably has showed up in my life experience. But of course, these are composite characters of a lot of different women. A lot of women. I've talked to, over 100 women about their hair journey and their experiences, and when they first realized they had good hair or bad hair, or when their earliest memories of their black hair intersecting with the white world, what they remembered about those things. And a lot of very common themes and circumstances.
What do you hope audiences get out of this? You know, when it's all that. And you know, when we talk audiences, you know, we obviously think about women, you know, black women who are being audience. But you know, what are you hoping that black men might get out of the play that gives them even a greater understanding or sensitivity, you know, to kind of hair politics in the black community?
Well, you know, I say that there's a lot in this piece for everybody, whether you're Black or not. In fact, the first time I shared any of this material, it was for a mostly white audience in Boulder, and it was so interesting to hear back, particularly from white women, about what their hair experiences were. And oh God, I touched a Black woman's hair. Oh Lord, thank you for telling me that was, no wonder she gave me the eye when that's right. So, you know, so I think part of my interest is that this is about education. This is entertainment. It's sort of, I want to create a space for dialogue, and I hope, you know, the role that Black men play in women's lives, it does come up in the piece, mostly around what we believe they want when it comes to hair. And I think, you know, it'd be interesting to see if they can challenge their notions about what is beautiful. They can be challenged in that way by this.
I love my hair when it's good, and then again when it looks defiant and impressive. Opens March the 8th at the Man Bites Dog Theater in Durham, North Carolina. We've been here this afternoon with the writer and director, Chaunesti Webb. Thanks for joining us, Chaunesti.
Thank you. Thank you.
I come from hot biscuits and molasses, liquor and linoleum, blueberries and blues. I come from beautiful crazy faces under and ensconced by weeping willows and polyester, slow southern nights and bodegas on city street corners, a place in between how it was and how it's gonna be. Warriors, rebels, humble peasants, and proud queens. I come from little girl dances to Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. History lost and futures found. Sweet, ripe pear juice dripping down my face. I come from what is fractured and whole, a shattered womb with talons, tongue-tied passion. It takes a village to raise this child. I come from Mr. Telephone Man, there's something wrong with my line. Cream of wheat with extra syrup spilling across both coasts. Artists, addicts, and deeply spiritual kin. I come from women, strong ones.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we are joined this afternoon by a very special guest, Professor Jafari Allen, who's the author of the new book, Venceremos, The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba. New book published by Duke University Press. How are you doing today,
I'm great.
Jafari?
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Jafari is a professor of anthropology and African American studies at Yale University, and he's visiting us here, giving a talk, in fact, this afternoon,
Yes.
Loosely based on your work. Talk a little bit about this project. And, you know, when folks hear the erotics of black self-making, you mentioned very early in the book that when folks hear erotics, they always think in terms of sex. But you're really kind of drawing from the work of Audre Lorde here and
Right.
thinking about erotics as part of a broader, really political process.
Absolutely. That
Erotics does, it is about sex, and it's about so much more than sex. Audre Lorde talks about the erotics being a hermeneutic, a way of understanding one's life. And as a sort of kernel, this beautiful moment where she says that it's like an intense condensed pellet that once you put it, that is sort of suffused through your life and through everything. And so I'm using erotics as a way to understand people's lives in Cuba, and also the way that they move and have their being in Cuba through their bodies, through sex, through race, gender, and their Cuban culture.
Quiet as it's kept, there are black people.
Quiet as it's kept.
And you know, we'd be surprised here in the United States how many folks don't quite wrap their head around that, you know, in any real significant kind of way. So talk about the dynamics of race in some place like Cuba.
Right. That's one of the reasons why when I give talks, I usually, I don't use pictures of any of my research respondents, but I think it's important to have just some pictures so people think of someone other than Ricky Ricardo when, because I have this feeling that that's the only reference for
Elian
Cuba.
Gonzalez.
Or Elian Gonzalez, right. But yeah, Cuba is a place that, for example, Fidel Castro proclaimed Cuba to be an African republic in the 60s, and what he was doing there was talking very, very clearly and consciously about the really deep African inheritance in music and in art and in religion. But what is not talked about very often is that blackness is not just a deep inheritance of everyone, but that there are people who actually identify as and are identified as black people in Cuba.
Talk a little bit about this, because in some ways, despite what Castro proclaimed, black folks in Cuba are very much marginalized.
Absolutely.
Right? Both in terms of their cultural impact politically. And you suggested, in fact, part of that marginalization creates a context for a certain kind of freedom. Right. Around this self-making, as you describe it, particularly around issues of sexuality.
Yeah, this book was researched during the special period in times of peace, which is roughly the time after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that was a moment in which the really constrained ways of being Cuba started to change. And so before, one had to be a good communist, one had to be atheist. And it was great if you were mestizo, and one had to sort of comport oneself in a particular way. But then when there wasn't much purchase in being a good revolutionary in that way, then other things start opening up. And so one of the things that you see is that a tremendous increase in Afro-Cuban religion. And so people who had been practicing sort of came out of the closet as santeros and made money that way. And the images of Cuba being a place that's hot and sexy are driven by images of black and mulatto people. And so it became a way that people could make money. And so it's opened up this space where this space of sort of deviance, following Kathy Cohen's work, where it allows for this freedom where people can do things that they perhaps could not do. Or could not do and get away with it even 10 or 15 years before.
You're watching Left to Black. We're joined by Professor Jafari Sinclair Allen, anthropologist, Yale University, author of the new book, Venceremos, The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba, Duke University Press. The regular question that an anthropologist gets, why Cuba? Why was Cuba the place that you chose to do your work? And when was your first trip to Cuba?
My first trip to Cuba was in 1998. And my intention was, my really ambitious intention was to do a dissertation project on comparative black masculinities. I wanted to go to Cuba, Brazil, and US. And my first week of graduate school, I sat down with my advisor and she said, pick one. And by that time I had already been to Cuba. But the reason sort of why Cuba goes back to this question of how quietly it's kept that there are black folks in Cuba. Right. And when I was growing up, my father delighted in telling me about black folks all over the world. Okay. And he was particularly interested in Cuba because of Fidel Castro, and because of the way that rumba and Cuban music circulated in New York, in Brooklyn, in the 50s and 60s when he was young. And so I went knowing that there were black folks there, and wanted to know what difference it makes, and whether the revolution had in fact cured racism.
And it's interesting because there are always these kind of interesting political connections. I mean, in some ways, Castro was very shrewd in terms of public relations, right? So to come to New York and not stay downtown, but to stay at the Black Teresa Hotel up in Harlem, the references to Malcolm X and all these kinds of things. Do you find it's when we talk about this gap, and obviously for mainstream Americans, there's this gap. But do you find the gap for Black Americans to know much more of this connection between Black American history and Cuban history, that this gap exists, is even more troubling? Yeah. There was a great book written by Digna Fuentes, an Afro-Cuban historian, and but there's been work on the interplay between Black Cuba and Black U.S. that tries to unearth these connections. Frank Garitti's new work, Forging Diaspora, is a great former colleague at UT is a great example of that sort of work. And I do think that we don't know a lot about that. But there are examples of, for example, when the World's Baseball Series was really a World Baseball Series, and when Black folks, at least in my parents' cohort, who are now in their 70s, they were very aware of people like Kid Chocolate, of boxers and baseball players. And certainly they were dancing at the Palladium to Afro-Cuban music. It's funny because when you hear terms like Afro-Cuban now, you always think 50 years ago. Yeah. Right? You don't think about it something that's fresh and alive. And really, with the exception of some hip-hop artists who've worked very hard, to get a sense of what's going on there, there really is this tremendous disconnect. Yeah. One of the stories that you tell in the book, and this is a way to talk about, because when you talk about this kind of self-making of identity, I mean, you're talking about queer bodies, queer Black bodies in some place like Cuba, and you tell the story of Lily. Yeah. And you're sitting there, and the great part of the book, and we've talked about this, off camera, about just how beautifully written the book is. Right, it has this feel of a travel log. So even as and we talked about kind of the struggles of social scientists in their writing. Right. The thing I really enjoyed about the book is I always felt as though I was sitting there, playing cards or playing dominoes, with you. But you tell the story of how you're just kind of, lazy afternoon, and Lily walks out. Yeah. And everybody sees her, and suddenly in her style of dress, it gets confirmed, right? That Lily is who they always knew was somebody else. And how, this is a man who is, cross-dressing. Yeah. And there are all kinds of epithets that are kind of thrown in the direction, and you kind of pause and take all of it in, and raise this question about, is there ever violence associated with that? Right. And so for a moment to do a kind of comparative of what those particular Black queer bodies might look like in some place like Cuba versus what those queer bodies look like in, hood USA. Yeah. And the different kind of freedoms that are associated with that. Right. And one of the things that's happened is that it's great to have to start a conversation and then have other people join that conversation. One of my students read this and identified with, not identified as Lily, but that in her neighborhood in Chicago, that there was somebody there was somebody who had always been and had been called a fag and et cetera, but had never sort of turned it up. Yeah. And then began turning it up, and described a similar sort of scene, but that this person knew in her hood where to go, where the bounds were, where it might get, you might have words
but knew essentially that they were going to be sort of safe and waited for that sort of moment. And what I find, in Hood US and other places, is that people have to find these moments or these places of relative safety. Like there is really no safety. Right. Audre Lorde said, "For the embattled, there is no place that can be home nor is."
It reminds me of some of the scenes you see in a movie like Pariah, right? And Pariah really is all. And don't tell me you haven't seen it. but it really is all about where these young black women find these kind of safe spaces, right? Right.
And this is one of the main impulses of Black queer studies, right? Is to show the agency of these subjects who are not necessarily just beaten down into a corner, but also beaten down perhaps, but getting up and finding spaces to do. And
I'm gonna put you on a spot here, but this is a different kind of question then, right? Using that same kind of logic, where are the safe spaces in fact for Black queer studies in the academy at this moment? Is it in an AFAM department? Is it in a gender and sexuality department? Is it in an anthropology?
Right. Now this is a video archive, and so whatever I say, we can go back years later and say, well, no, he was quite wrong about that. I don't, one of the things that I'm talking about today, and the piece that I'm delivering today is called "The Ethnography of Black Queer Diaspora: Tracing Circuits of Desire." And one of the things that I'm arguing is that what I'm doing, what some of us are doing, is at this crossroads of all of those things that we talked about, but in all of those spaces, we've had to sort of push ourselves into those spaces. And and I think it depends on the journal, it depends on the department, it depends on very particular sorts of configurations. We've been very fortunate recently, after the wonderful work that people like Sharon Holland and E. Patrick Johnson and Kathy Cohen have done, and Dwight McBride and many others, to have some visibility, and for example,
coherence.
Right. But GLQ allowed us to do a special issue. So I just edited a special issue called Black Queer Diaspora that has lots of new wonderful work by some fairly senior people like Omisheke Natasha Tinsley, but also Matt Richardson, who you know from UT, and a really brilliant graduate student, Vanessa Agar Jones, and Lyndon Gill, who just graduated from Harvard, and my graduate student, the novelist Ina Lara. And so one of the things that you'll see when you read this article, when you read this special journal issue, is that the language is different from other GLQ issues and from perhaps Souls or the W.E.B. Du Bois Review. The references are a lot more promiscuous, but also there are these different genealogies. So for example, Matt writes really beautifully about Jackie Kay's novel Trumpet, about transgender realities and imaginaries in Scotland. But he doesn't use any references to what we understand as queer theory. And so this is the thing about what's happening in black queer studies now. It's matured to the point where we have our own references and we can draw from a number of places. But whether that's safe or not, in terms of is a different question that some of us are watching very closely. Because our legibility in the academy depends on it. Right. But the politics of our project is that we must do it whether it's legible to particular disciplines or not.
Yeah. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Jafari Allen, who is an anthropologist at Yale. He's the author of the brand new book, Venceremos, The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba, that's published by Duke University Press. Were there any surprises for you, as you were going in, wondering what you were going to write about, what you were going to discover in Cuba? As you came out on the other side, were there any things that just really surprised you in terms of what you found?
Yeah, I think almost everything. Almost everything.
Well, that's a good project.
Yeah, I think Cuba is one of those places, and lots of books. I don't know that there's anything written about Cuba that doesn't include the word contradiction. Yeah. Because there are contradictions at every turn and complexities. I was surprised, especially reading a lot of the literature on Cuba. I was surprised at how deeply and intensely people who were described in other literature as Afro-Cuban or just Cuban identified as Black. I shouldn't have been surprised if I'd listened carefully to my father, right? But I was surprised. I was surprised at that. I was surprised at how much people knew about African American literature and culture, and I was also surprised on the other side at the intensity of certain forms of interpersonal racism in Cuba, and the ways in which it is it's epidermalized, or it's colored in ways that that I had not experienced in my life, but had heard stories about. And people, especially people who live in the South, who make a clear distinction between a red bone.
I mean, they fetishize.
Absolutely. I should have known that also. I went to undergrad in Atlanta, which is a different kind of South, not the global South.
Right. What's next for you?
What is next for me? What is next for me is a project that I've been working on for the past 2 years, which is called, what is it called? It's called Black Queer Here and There, Movement and Sociality in the Americas. So one part of the book is about actual on-the-ground activism of queer subjects working on sexual orientation discrimination in the Caribbean. And another part is on movement in terms of immigration and tourism, and the movement of Black queer ideas and texts around the Americas.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Jafari Allen, who's the author of the brand new book, Venceremos, The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba. That would be this wonderful book here with this beautiful cover. Duke University Press. He teaches anthropology and African American studies. Shout out to Elizabeth Alexander.
Yes, hey Elizabeth.
Thanks for joining us today, Jafari.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.